Okay. Well, I came into the department in 1979, and at that time, Carl Eicher was one of the senior faculty members who worked on international development, particularly in Africa. And he had at least one large project funded by USAID. It was called Alternative Rural Development Strategies. And this was as I've recently learned, a 7-year project that had some core funding and then supported activities in different countries in Africa. And one of which was in what was then called Upper Volta, where we'd had a big team in the field in in the eastern region. And they had done a bunch of surveys. They had started to write this up, and Carl asked me to work with the team to help with the write-up of some of the things that they did. And I got a chance to go out to Upper Volta and visit the project area, and that was a lot of fun. But by that time, so that's what we're now considering to be sort of the start of the food security group during that period, sort of the mid 70s.
Right.
And he had other projects before that time that focused on African rural employment, which was an activity that was joint with the economics department. So at the time I came, the department was already well known within USAID, and Eicher was well known in the profession. And so, the department had credibility, it had a track record. And, the amazing thing is, and so there was a team working on this. It was some tenure stream faculty members and some fixed term faculty members, people employed just to work on these projects. And then support staff, significant number of support staff. And the amazing thing is that we've been able to keep this going since then.
Yeah.
And there's been some evolution in the orientation of the projects. But it's pretty unique. There really isn't another similar example here at MSU. Maybe I shouldn't say that. It's possible that you could argue that it's not possible. It's likely that you could argue that the nuclear physics department has had some similar long-term success with, like, FRIB is a big long-standing project, but among elsewhere in the university, you don't typically find within a given department a group that's been able to maintain the level of activity and the level of funding that we have over time. And I would say, initially, the key sort of success factors in this were we were focusing on real world problems. We were trying to not only contribute to the university's mission, because what we were doing included research, it included graduate training, it included outreach, but it was very client oriented. The extension activities of MSU as a land grant mission, they're client oriented. You within our department, the people who work on extension, they're trying to produce information that's useful to the farmers and others as clients. And so this was very much the orientation of these programs, is that we would generate information that people in USAID would find to be useful. And it was also a team effort. And there were, you could say that within the broader team, there were subgroups of people who had somewhat different orientations, and those that focused on marketing had a kind of common conceptual framework, because in part it consisted of some senior faculty and then people who'd been their students.
Hmm.
And then there were people who focused on more on the production side and had that kind of background and orientation. But to implement these projects really required a team effort. And that's really been a hallmark of the food security program from that point in time. And I think that the all of these elements are still there. I think that whereas in the 70s and 80s, the orientation of the research was quite practical, in part because at that time the donor, namely USAID, was not interested, seemed not to be interested in academic issues. Didn't really want to see us working just to publish articles in academic journals. They wanted information that they could use to improve their programs, to help, ensure that the money they're spending would have an impact on
That
people.
makes sense. Yeah.
And I would say that this is still true, but beginning with the Feed the Future initiative, which was started by President Obama when he came in 2008, tremendous amount of money went into that. I think that was originally a $3.8 billion initiative. And one of the things USAID did is they hired 200 or 300 new people to work on this, many of whom were PhD holders. And so naturally, with all those people having gone through PhD programs, they were used to the idea of doing academic research and publishing in journals. And
so they found that more valuable.
And so whereas we would not so much have emphasized this part of our output in earlier days, after the Feed the Future initiative started and this new group of people came into USAID, if we went to Washington to make presentations to them, to tell them about what we were doing, very frequently the first question they would ask is, well, what stuff have you published about this? Now, and at that point, I think there was a little bit of a shift in the outlets that we use, that our faculty use to disseminate the work, switching more from our own department publications, which we had set up, years before. There were a succession of publication series that had been set up for the international publications, the rural economy papers, the African rural employment papers, the rural development papers. Then we set up the international development papers and working papers and the policy syntheses. And all of our material was published in those series, except for the work that got published in journals. But then I think as USAID's interest, as they started to recognize more the value of things being published in journals, the same was true within the department. I think that this became more the norm. And so there really has been a tremendous growth in the amount of research results that have come out of this group that get published in academic journals. And so, a big benefit of that is it creates greater visibility for the work and lends more credibility to to the work, and so that's a good thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like, do you feel like, that was driven by was there no journals before that and then there were journals, or was it just that, and this is just honestly me being curious.
Oh, well, there certainly has been a growth in the number of journals, but there were plenty of academic journals back in the 70s. It's not like there was a shortage of journals. There was the American Journal of Agricultural Economics. That was the main journal for our profession. Economic Development and Cultural Change.
So they were around.
Journals of agricultural economics. I don't remember when World Development started, or Food Policy. Those are journals that a lot of our faculty's work has been published in, and those are newer, but not that new. So yeah, there were plenty of
So it
journals.
really was just the shift in the USAID.
That's right. It was an emphasis on, it was two things, two related things. One, it was an emphasis on the work having relevance for solving practical problems, or providing a basis for improvement of USAID funded programs.
Right.
And secondly, it was a desire to get results quickly. Because, everybody in a donor agency is under pressure to move the money and show results. So they don't want to give you X $100,000 and then wait 5 years to see the result in some journal. They want this more quickly. And so this is the rationale for the working paper. You do some work, you get some preliminary results, you write them up, you get them out. People who are on the front lines trying to improve things can benefit from that more quickly than otherwise.
Yeah, well, and there's no paywall or anything like that either, which is something that seems to be you're right in the middle of this transition where everybody's supposed to make sure that their journal articles are public, and there's no funding to do that.
Yeah.
It seems like a tight spot for everyone.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah.
So, I think these sort of hallmarks of the group. First of all, I think success breeds success. So if when I came in, there was already a track record that had been gained by the people here, and it goes back before then. I mean, there were other people, Glenn Johnson and others, who were key people in the profession, Jim Schaefer, Harold Riley, Al Schmidt, and so on. And so once you get a reputation for doing good work, then people will come to you more. But then you have to keep delivering, and you have to keep, if one of the challenges of a team approach is it's that many more people that you have to that need care and feeding, basically, and of a range of sorts. But you got to be able to keep paying their salaries, and so you got to be able to keep bringing in the funding. And to do that, you have to continue to do work that the donors appreciate and are willing to.
In a changing landscape.
In a changing landscape. So we were fortunate. We had, you've heard the story, but starting in 1982, we got the first of what we can loosely call 3 10-year cooperative agreements, which had some core funding, and then allowed us to take funding from individual country USAID missions and do country level activities. But after those 3 food security projects ended, we got another longer term cooperative agreement, the Food Security Policy Cooperative Agreement. And that was the first one. The previous 3 had been implemented just by us. MSU was the sole implementer, but with food security policy now we had 2 other partners. We had IFPRI and we had University of Pretoria.
Okay.
But that was a project that came on stream early during the Feed the Future era when there was a lot of money. So we were able, and that was an umbrella that, because of the emphasis on policy, it appealed to a lot of country missions and within USAID. So we got a fair amount of funding from individual country missions. So that project got big. We had a lot of money. We hired more people. We had more country level projects and so on. And that was extended, I think, at least for 7 years, if not for another 10. And then we got the PRCI project.
As I understand it, there's still a couple of FSP things that aren't even done yet. Like they're still
right.
going.
Well, that's right. One of them being the project in Myanmar.
Yeah.
But at each stage, you have to, it's a competition. There's a lot of other universities that have people who do international work. I guess we feel that we're among the few that has quite a lot of that, but there are other universities that have a history of doing work internationally. So it's competitive. I mean, you can't just count on getting more money because you did a reasonable job on your current project. That's kind of a necessity, but it's not sufficient
Right.
to bring you another project. And
it's the baseline.
Yeah. So we got the PRCI project, and you'd asked me, what things, was I especially proud of or enjoyed the most? And I would say, first of all, I guess the fact that we were able to continue the support for this work over time, given the large number of fixed-term faculty that we had. I mean, it has ranged from, let's say, 10 to nearly 25. During the food security policy project period, we had over 20 fixed-term faculty, and things happen. We had a 35-year engagement in Mali, but during that period, there was 1 year when USAID, for whatever reason, they just didn't get around to renewing the funding. So we had to kind of tighten our belts for a year, and we had to get some bridging funds from the university to support that. And then in 2012, they had a coup, and that has progressively become worse. So that era, which was a successful era of activity in Mali, came to an end. And we got going in Myanmar and did a lot of very well received field work to help the new civilian government figure out how to orient their economic policies. And did some training, did a lot of things, partnering with IFPRI. And then the military takes over again.
Yeah.
And that comes to an end. You can't prevent that. You can't.
This is the real world. It's not a lab.
So
yeah.
So during this long period, there have been some times when we've needed some help. I mean, I guess I would say personally that on balance, we've contributed an awful lot to the university and to the department and the college just through the funding that has come in. But there have been times when we needed some bridging funds, and we also 2 or 3 times we got significant funding from the university, kind of like venture capital to help us gear up. And the biggest example of this was in 2009, again, right at the beginning of the Feed the Future initiative, after President Obama had come in and launched this initiative on food security. And we said, hey, we're sitting here, we have a track record of doing this, we can do more of this. If we had more people, we could do more of this.
Right, right.
So we appealed to the university, and we were successful in getting an agreement to fund 2 tenure stream faculty members in development economics in our department and 3 fixed term faculty members. And we got $400,000 to help cover that. And that was a very, very significant investment, and it paid off handsomely. We could go, we've gone back and have kind of looked at what the outcome of that was in terms of how the program expanded and the additional work that was done and the additional funding that came in. And I think that was an investment that paid off handsomely for the university.
Yeah.
And then 2016, we did a somewhat similar appeal for some investment funding from the university. And we got some, when I say from the university, this includes the department and the college and the provost's office. It's not just
Okay.
the central administration that was contributing to this. And so we did get some extra funding we did get a second round of some additional funding, and that's been terrifically helpful. But the flexibility in order to keep things going, you need to have you need to either have a reserve that you can draw on if it doesn't rain,
Right.
or you need to be able to borrow somehow to cover.
It's like having a business.
It's like having a business, sure.
Yeah, it's the same thing.
Everybody who had a business, during COVID, had this problem.
Except for me, because I was doing websites and everybody needed a website.
There you go. Okay. You were in the right business.
I was.
COVID proof business.
Yeah, who knew, right? Yeah.
So, it's, while we would say, in general, this has been an activity that's been more than self-supporting in the sense that it's generated a surplus. There have been times when we've needed some bridging funds, and fortunately, we've been able to get that. And
it doesn't seem like it's been that often.
No. And another important part of this is that this activity was always integrated within the department. I think that there are some who feel that it should have been or should be more integrated. And when Titus came in as department chair, he encouraged us to be more active in bringing in to work with us other people in the department, other tenure stream faculty in the department, and so we've done that. To some extent, that was happening all along, but I think with his encouragement, we've been more proactive to do that, and that's been very helpful. And one of the things that has made that fairly easy to bring about is that a big feature of these projects historically has been collection of new data. And so when we're collecting good quality new data, that presents opportunities for research. And so, other people in the department, if you say, hey, here's something we're doing, would you be interested? And by the way, we've got some data that hasn't been analyzed yet, that can be a win-win situation. We can get input from people with particular research skills.
Yeah.
They can get access to data that they wouldn't otherwise have. So, and this is great for students. I mean, students have been an integral part of this. And in fact, a big dimension of all of these projects historically has been capacity building, both in terms of individual training and building of institutional capacity, including things like helping to set up new policy research institutes. You doubtless are familiar with this.
Yeah.
But involving grad students has always been a big part of this. And this also has been something that was originally a hard sell with USAID, but I think they have always come to appreciate the value. I mean, when we would tell them, this is a kind of a hypothetical or a kind of a generalization of the way the conversation goes, but if you bid on a project and you include graduate students in the budget and you talk about having graduate students doing field work, sometimes they would grumble because what they would prefer is that seasoned professors would be doing all this work. But the fact is that the graduate students can actually do things better in some ways because A, they're willing and able to get out in the field and do some of the hard work. B, they're being trained with up-to-date techniques and they're highly motivated. So you get really tremendous value from that. And
Yeah. Yeah.
of course, that's what a university is.
Well, and that's the
Therefore,
pipeline, that's what you're supposed to, yeah.
So this again is a way in which these projects are contributing to the university's mission of training new people, and the projects have contributed in a variety of ways to the building of local capacity in the different countries where we're working, and that too has gone through. There's been pendulum swings there in terms of USAID's interest, because I think during the 50s and 60s and maybe I'm starting too far back, but say 60s, 70s, 80s, they invested a lot in training and in establishing new institutions, like new research institutions. And then they became disillusioned when, not all of the students returned back to exactly where they came from. Some might have stayed in the US, some might have gone to other countries, some might have gone to work in a different institution in their
So they
home
didn't feel
country.
like they were getting a return on their
They
investment.
didn't feel like, they were getting their full return.
Yeah.
And they would support new universities or new research institutes, and then these new institutions sometimes kind of weren't able to stay alive over a longer time period, so they became disillusioned. But they came back around again. I mean, that's something where we saw some big cycles where in the early 2000s, the USAID kind of woke up and said, "Hey, we've got to start providing some more support for training. We have to be smarter about this." They always want to be smarter, which is good. So they wanted to see some projects that would experiment with different ways of doing training and capacity building so that some of the old problems wouldn't occur. And we had a couple of those. I was involved in a couple of those that we had, and MyWish was involved in a similar project at the same time, where we were trying to do training where we increased the amount of the program that took place in the country rather than here in the US, and provided close support for the in-country research through a combination of MSU faculty and faculty from the countries, from the universities that the students were coming from. So, and another kind of pendulum that swung was that in the 70s and 80s, a lot of donor agencies, and this included Ford Foundation and Rockefeller Foundation, they provided support for agricultural research. And again, there was a point at which some disillusionment set in about the impact of that, because while from a scientific point of view, new varieties had been produced, you couldn't see that they'd all been accepted by farmers and that productivity had gone up. There were exceptions to that. You've heard about the miracle rices in Asia.
Mm-hmm.
They were tremendously more productive, but in terms of grain yield,
Yeah.
but they were also they were much heavier users of water and fertilizer.
I mean, that makes sense. You're turning, it doesn't come out of nothing.
That's right. You can't produce it out of thin air. Plants need nutrients and they need water. So that was the Green Revolution, and that was a terrific thing. And that then started to show some downsides in terms of overuse of existing water supplies and nutrient pollution and one thing or another. But that at least was a case where the research had produced a variety that farmers really liked, and they planted it and production went way up. And so you could kind of see the payoff.
It was a win.
If you weren't aware of and you weren't accounting for some of the long run downsides, it really looked good.
Right.
But in some cases, for non-irrigated crops and some crops in Africa, there hasn't been the same green revolution. And so
I got that feel. I was reading all the historical stuff, and it seemed like in Korea in particular, there was a lot of research in South Korea that I read the papers and stuff, and it was very positive. And it's like, now I look at South Korea and it's very successful. It seems like there was stuff that was happening in Africa kind of concurrently, but it didn't have the same sort of outcome.
Yeah, well, that's been a big topic in the field, and not to try to go into the details, I wouldn't be the best person to do that. But one explanation is most parts of Africa are ecologically different from Asia. They're drier. That's a generalization, because there's certainly some high rainfall areas in Africa. And in many places, they don't have the well-developed markets and other institutions that can support high input agriculture. So there's reasons why you haven't seen that, but there's also some successes in terms of development of new varieties for Africa. Maize, for example, even some of the root crops like cassava.
It seemed like cowpea, there's
cowpea, I think is an example. Yeah, but anyway, one of the things that we did in the 90s was to carry out a set of studies where we calculated the economic rate of return to investment in agricultural research. Now this was something that a type of analysis that had been done earlier in the U.S. So what we did was to apply similar techniques to doing studies. We did studies in Mali and Uganda and Zambia and Niger and Senegal, Maybe there were some other countries where we did this too. Kenya, I think, was one. And, we showed that in general, agricultural research is a profitable investment. It's a good thing to invest in. And
Yeah.
IFPRI has done, they put out a paper in which they reported on somewhat similar analysis of what kinds of investments in agricultural development really pay off. And agricultural research is one of them.
Yeah.
So these studies were helpful to aid in kind of rebuilding their enthusiasm to support agricultural research. Even though anybody who actually does agricultural research knows that you can carry out 10 different programs and maybe only one of them will really succeed. And it's not like they all succeed.
That's kind of life, though.
Sure
I mean, right? Yeah,
that's right. Yeah. So anyway, it was interesting for me to be involved in this because I hadn't really had exposure to doing that kind of work. And one of the other faculty members who came into the department a little bit after I did, Jim Emke, worked on this with us, and he was somebody who really knew the method well. And so I kind of learned about this in part from him, and I enjoyed that. But so this was in both of these cases, the training and capacity development and the ag research. I think the work that we did, which was funded by AID, really influenced them, really helped them, resume commitment for some of these kinds of programs. And now, these food security programs, they always started from the premise that to make progress in terms of agricultural development or economic development, you had to, there were various dimensions. There was technology, there was policy, and there were institutions. And they were all important. You couldn't just focus on one and expect a success. You had to address constraints in each of these three areas.
Yeah.
And in terms of the food security projects, we had these three initial 10-year projects that they were just sort of generally focused on food security. But then the fourth one was focused on food security policy.
Yeah.
And this was so this recognized that okay, you could be investing in a project, but if the government's policies provided disincentives in some way that it sort of held back the success of your program, then okay, you needed to take that into account. You needed to do something to put in place more supportive policy. So it had a focus on that, and it had a focus on more on getting policymakers to actually change policy. I mean, it went from just saying, okay, we really want you to communicate your results to policymakers, to saying, okay, we want you to actually influence policy. We want to see policymakers actually doing things differently and better because of what your research results are helping them to understand. So
that's an uphill battle, I imagine.
And well, I suppose like anything, USAID's view of what good policies are is somewhat colored by U.S. national interests. So our idea of good policy isn't necessarily the same as what the leaders of a particular country might see, but nonetheless, I mean, ultimately, and this was something that became more emphasized during Obama's administration when a guy named Raj Shah took over as administrator of USAID. He
Mm.
was a medical doctor and he had worked at the Gates Foundation, and he very much supported the idea of evidence-based policymaking. So that was great
Yeah.
because, to get evidence, that means doing research. It means, coming up with facts, so to speak,
Yeah. Yeah.
that support a particular position.
Right.
And as we've seen more recently, some people don't believe facts, as such.
Isn't that the great debate these days?
They're
Is
your
how,
facts. They're not really true.
what is a fact?
Exactly.
Let's ponder.
So, but nonetheless, that's still very much the foundation of AIDS project. So right now, I mean, this morning, I participated in a Zoom session that Dave Shirley organized to help prepare
Yeah,
for.
I listened in on
You
that.
were on that. So
Yeah,
if you
that
looked
was
at,
wild.
yeah, well, it was wild, except well organized. I mean, it wasn't chaotic.
I didn't mean it wild like chaotic. Wild more like wow.
Yeah.
There's that was a large cross section of
Yeah.
varied groups brought together for a single
Yes.
purpose in a very impressive way.
Yes, I agree with that. And so in PRCI, we're still partnering with IFPRI, but we've brought in some people from other units. But it looks like for this new one, there would be a more concentrated effort to involve additional sources of expertise, additional firms or organizations that can bring their expertise to bear on this. But if you look at the project, the call for proposals, it has a heavy emphasis on evidence and on documenting, on tracking the success of efforts that have been put in place. So, I mean, this is the monitoring and evaluation and learning perspective that you want to make your project management take into account what you can see is actually happening, and you want to be able to adjust your project midstream if it seems necessary to do that. And so it implies a lot of information gathering about how things are going, and because this involves developing capacity to make good decisions about climate-friendly development. There's a lot of decisions that have to be made, so you want to be gathering information that's going to help decision makers make good decisions. It doesn't have, it doesn't say, okay, we're going to take a third of the budget and let you guys do research with it. It's more indirect and targeted than that, but it's still clear that they want the project to help support, climate resilient development planning with information.
Right.
So we'll see. I mean, I don't know how we feel like that's how we operate, but I mean, at the level of the U.S. government, I'm not sure that that's as true. Or maybe the way to put it is there's other factors at work in influencing decisions, just like there are in different countries.
Yeah.
So,
Well, it seems like, I mean, there's this acknowledgement of like the localization thing, but like we need, it's like it's one thing to tell a kid to go clean the room, and it's an entirely different thing for them to actually go clean the room. I mean, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, yeah, that's right. And there are anyway. So I would say I'm getting back to your question about what things I've been proudest of. I mean, I think that the our success in getting this big funding to prepare us to take advantage of the Feed the Future initiative, that was very important. That helped us and the department. I mean, it brought in 2 tenure stream positions, which is a clear benefit for the department, and increased the funding, um, and then we've been able to weather some other sort of drought years since then. Again, sometimes with the support of the department and the college and the provost, um, and keep the group going. Well, and so somewhat similar to that, I was happy that we were able to successfully um, get funding from USAID Kenya to do the project in Kenya that MyWish is the lead PI on.
The Sarakia?
Yes, that's right. That didn't look like it was going to be worthwhile. And then they kept encouraging us to consider it. And we were having a problem identifying a person to lead it. And then we were able to persuade MyWish to do it.
She seems like she gets persuaded a lot.
Well, she had to be persuaded to replaced Duncan as director of FSP midstream, and she did a very good job. So anyway, but it was, I was glad that we were able to work that out despite some problems. The other thing that I was glad of is that in the case of PRCI, we, at least to some extent, we folded into that project work by people that had carried out programs as part of the project that funded GCFSI, the Global Center for Food System Innovation, which was set up in 2013. And I joined that as project director in 2014. And one of the activities that we carried out that was led by Kurt Richter, that we carried out in Malawi, was called the Innovation Scholars Program, which was a capacity development program in the sense of helping people to understand what innovation is, and helping them understand how to apply the principles of human-centered design in various areas, including research or teaching or whatever. And there were several other people from MSU who were involved in that, including John Maidendorp and John Bonnell, who John Maidendorp was involved then in. So we folded that into PRCI as an activity, as a type of capacity development that would support the centers that we were working with in PRCI.
Yeah.
So
that's really quite cutting edge there.
Well, we had talked about ways of coordinating or integrating, if not merging, GCFSI with the food security group, and that didn't ever happen at a sort of institutional level, but at least in terms of the nature of the work, we were able to kind of pull in from GCFSI that strain of activity and make it a part of PRCI, and I hope that has been a successful part of PRCI.
I think so. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's lovely. Thank you. It's always just really interesting to hear. It's one thing to I read a lot of stuff. I read a lot of papers and working papers and whatever. It's really interesting to hear it spoken and shared in that more lived way.
Yeah. Well, and not all of the. I mean, when you look at the one of the things that I'm still working on is this historical milestones of AFRI's international activity, and that Mike Weber first drafted in 2015. That covers the whole department. That's meant to tell the story of what faculty in the department overall are doing. And again, from when I came here in the 70s, at 79, there was no self-described food security group then. That kind of emerged later, but you had involvement from a range of faculty in the department and tenure stream faculty, and also then some faculty who were just sort of project hires. And that's been true all along. And there have always been some tenure stream faculty who've collaborated with the group. Since, within the last 10 years, the scope for that has expanded. But, and so the vast majority of international projects in the department get coordinated administratively by the Food Security Group business office.
Yep.
But within the last, I would say, 10 years, the coordination of them by PIs has been a little more decentralized. Since 2006, we kind of made a decision, we, the people in the group, to have a more decentralized management structure where people who were PIs on a given project were more in charge of the management of that, but there were still FSG co-directors whose job was to kind of help with the overall coordination and provide an interface to the department and the rest of the university, in part to help with issues of funding and
these bridging moments.
Right, that's right. And there are cases where projects have been managed by our business office that aren't directly related to other things, but that hasn't really been a problem. That's become one of the reasons, one of the time periods during which the team approach was more evident and natural this was really, I would say, during the period of the first 3 10-year food security grants, because for those, the funding had a large core funding component, and so that covered student that could go for student assistantships, that could go for salaries for the business office staff and for some fixed term faculty, but that was something that then could be planned, could be used for the group as a whole and could be planned for on that basis. And I think with the third of those cooperative agreements in particular, um, instead of just giving us core funding and saying, here's a check, do what you think is good. We had to do annual work plans. We had to, one or two people would come from Washington to campus, and we'd spend a couple days basically developing a work plan. And so it was highly structured. And in order to do that, we had to, we had to figure out who was going to do what and when, and how are we going to do it? How are we going to synchronize these various activities? So it had to be a team planning approach. And so there was a lengthy period of time. It was more than just that 10 years, but there was a lengthy period of time where we had weekly management meetings that everybody came to, because everybody was involved in multiple things. And we didn't want to be, nobody really wanted decisions made about something they were involved in without themselves being there to say, hey, you're kind of writing me in to do this during March, but I've already committed to doing, something else in March. So, but once we stopped receiving that kind of core funding and we stopped being asked to do sort of annual work plans for kind of a global project activity as opposed to sort of specific activities, there was less rationale for that. And so things have become a little bit more decentralized. And so, Suida, for example, she's had large projects in Nigeria, and she certainly coordinates, but she doesn't do that by sitting in weekly management meetings. She interacts more directly with the business office, and so
she just pretty much, I just get emails that are like, I need you to do this thing. And I'm like, okay, I'll do that thing.
Yeah. So, and the point at which more coordination is, one of the points at which more coordination is needed is when, if there's a funding problem, if the funding on project A dries up and somebody is without 100% coverage, then what?
Right.
So
those challenging moments where you need the bridge funding.
Yeah, or you need to be figuring out how, in a legitimate way, you can cover some of an individual's time on another project. Well, what can they do that would be consistent with that project's work plan, and so so, and you'd also asked where I think the group should go. Well, I think that I think that the group has responded to suggestions from the department chair about involving more proactively involving other tenure stream faculty, and so I think that's been done pretty successfully. I mean, there's not everybody that doesn't fit a lot of people's programs, but there are lots of cases where it does. So, and I think that's happening more than it used to. And in other ways, the fixed term faculty are somewhat more integrated into the department as a whole. which is a little tricky because when someone is funded 100% on grants, um, they're not supposed to be doing stuff that doesn't relate to those grants. So serving on committees, for example, really isn't something you should be spending your time on.
Hmm.
Advising students, yes, because when you're doing that, you're usually advising students that are doing work that relates to the grant.
Right.
But and even spending time writing proposals for new funding, strictly speaking, is a no-no too.
And but yet that's totally illogical because how, like what? I'm sorry, I'm done now. Oops, no more funding. I mean, you'd run out of
Well,
funding.
this all stems from the principle that you're not supposed to use the funds from grant A to do work on grant B. You can't cross subsidize.
Right.
And so the same principle applies to spending time paid for on grant A that on which you're actually doing something else, something that doesn't relate to grant A. And so there are these general kinds of duties that fall into that
I don't know. That sounds a
category.
lot like how like you're not supposed to have a logo for any of your innovation labs, and yet everybody has a logo for their innovation lab. I'm like, oh,
Well,
there's the rules, and then there's the rules.
well, yes, and so I think nobody is looking at this as closely as they might, but you don't want to cross the line just because you drove from here to Detroit at 85 miles an hour one day. That doesn't mean you aren't going to get stopped the next day. Uh,
Yeah.
so uh, you know, so there are some issues there. It's a good thing to have fixed term faculty be more involved in the department because they're doing things that are important to the department in terms of its core mission, research and supporting graduate students and so on. Teaching, some of them are doing teaching. They get sort of paid for that.
That
Uh,
sounds not good.
but uh, there's some practical limit. So that's a challenge. That's a challenge. One fix for that would be to say that the department should be covering some nominal share of the fixed term faculty member's salary to do these other things like serving on committees or writing grants. Um, and that's rarely happened, and that's because um, that's because the department has lots of needs for its budget.
Yeah, yeah.
It's not flush with money. Yes, part of its income comes from overhead from these projects, but there's also big demands. There's things that need to be covered. So it's easy to say, well, you could just put that in the bank and then use that, but
Yeah. Easier
yeah.
said than done.
So it's easy enough to say how it could be done to build up a rainy day fund. This is something John Statz had recommended in the past, that instead of our having to make appeals for bridging funds on an ad hoc basis when the need arose.
Mhm.
If a rainy day fund were created, then we could draw on it when needed, and it wouldn't be such a big deal. But nobody really wants to do that. The university has never. I mean, they prefer, I don't know that this has ever been stated, but just from looking at it, this is what they prefer. They prefer not to, create a rainy day fund that we know anything about, but just, if we have a need, then we come to them and explain the need and ask them for help, and
Right.
they generally help.
Right. Right.
But
Well, and it
that's,
seems like you can't build your own because you have to have like the spending rate, and you're not allowed to save any of that back. I mean, you can't even save enough to cover the cost to make stuff public.
yeah, there's two ways. There's really, we've had only two sources of flexible funding. One is, um, we have gotten in these last two cases of appeals for university support, we have gotten money, which
Mm.
which we've put into an account that we refer to as the strengthening account. It's really kind of meant to be a venture capital
Mm.
account, in the sense of money that we can use to help us go after, additional opportunities.
Yeah.
So it's not a slush fund to be used for just anything. It's venture capital. We do have another account that's potentially more like a slush fund, where, in this, we haven't really been able to we haven't been able to put much money into this lately, but it used to be fed by cases where we had what are called fixed price contracts, where
Mm.
you said, okay, I'll do this and just pay me 10,000 and we'll call it good.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so then if you do it for 9,000, you've got 1,000 left over and you can
Yeah.
pay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So there were cases, and we're not talking about big money, but there are cases where that happened. And so we did. I assume we may have a few dollars in that too, but um, otherwise
Yeah.
that's it. I mean, we probably still have some of both of those funds, but that's because we've been careful at how we've used those. And so
Makes sense. But it's difficult. That's yeah, it's not very sustainable in some ways.
yeah, well, it has been
It's
sustainable.
been impressively sustainable even
Yeah,
amongst all the challenges.
yeah, yeah. Well, the last time we made an appeal was when we thought we were projecting a decline in funding, and we were projecting a shortfall in terms of our ability to cover salaries. And we did not we were not successful in convincing the dean to provide any support. And Titus he was out in front trying to make that case, but not successful. And fortunately, it turned out we didn't need it. It turned out that, once again, we were able to bring in some additional funding, and so
Made it work.
it it worked out. But um, there's other problems, and of course the university, in the last let's say 5 years, the university has taken two very large hits. One,
Oh, yeah.
one from Nasser and one from COVID. And
Mhm.
it actually has turned out that the COVID hit was not nearly as bad as they thought.
Well,
Um,
that's good.
so, however, I mean, on balance, I think the university is probably worse off than they would have been without those two uh,
I would
events.
say sometimes I wonder if there's been a lot of communication shifts and there's a lot of gaps in A&R, like
Yeah,
a surprising amount. And I have to wonder if some of that isn't because there's so much shifting because comms gets hit really hard in those kinds of things. It's a very, very stressful job at that point because you're doing crisis control.
Yeah.
So I wonder if that's part of why that happened.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, right. Somebody was telling me, I forget. Anyway, this is just, it was just another example of somebody saying that something isn't happening because it's like there's only half of the normal people in the office, so no wonder things are not moving. But anyway,
Yeah.
So
Anyway,
in terms of things that I think the group should be focusing on, I would have just said climate change, and that's actually what they're heading into right now.
right.
So I think that's a sensible approach, not only because it's clearly a big problem globally speaking, but because AID is considering it a priority, so they're putting money into it. So it makes sense for two reasons.
Yeah. Yeah. Now it's sort of the pressing issue of our times.
Yeah. Yeah.
So one of the other questions I had that's maybe a little more lighthearted is, though maybe not, because I hear that you're going to be helping this month, you're going to be helping to write helping Dave to work on the proposal. At least that's what he said.
Well, a little bit anyway. Yeah.
So what do you plan to do in your retirement?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I guess I'm not as far along in terms of wrapping some things up as I thought, but so that the main thing that falls into that category is revising the historical milestones document. I have done a fair amount on that, but haven't wanted to circulate a revised draft until I had done what I could to fold in information about about the international involvement of people in the department other than those we would typically consider part of FSG.
Mm.
Because for various reasons, I think, Mike tried hard to have this be an account that covered everybody in the department. And so I want to make sure that we can do that through the president. And it was unexpectedly hard to pull together that information. I think I've talked to you about this, but the website, it's like the castle made out of sand at the edge of the ocean. It just it's there for a while, but then a wave comes in and it's gone.
Yeah.
At least the sand is there somewhere, but it gets redistributed.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I have learned now. I've talked to Dennis Bond, and I've learned I've started to learn how to use the Wayback Machine to find to get to old websites, and from there to get some information. But it's a time-consuming process. I mean, I got information, I got data on grants, international grants by department faculty, and some of them are by people who aren't here anymore, but they aren't, their profiles weren't on the web page that Mike Weber put together for emeritus faculty.
Mm-hmm.
So I had to figure out other ways of getting that information, and I found some of them. And it's just, it's just variable. When you look at the web profiles of current faculty, they vary in terms of what information they put in there.
That's my next big project.
So some people say when they first join the department, and some people don't.
I know. Yep. And some of it's way out of date, and some people some people send me their CV every 6 months and they're like, update it now. And I'm like, okay, it just, yeah, that I'm trying to get it all. I mean, we're getting better at website technology, so I'm hoping that it's going to be a little less like castles in the sand and a little more like, you know, concrete in the sand, you know, a little more resilient. Considering that just the technology and the awareness of how to like migrate information and that it's important to
Right.
keep that.
Well, so what Dennis said, you probably know this, or he's said this to you, but he said that, it was a good thing what Mike did, which was to um, he created the profiles as, what are they called? Objects?
Data sets.
Data sets, exactly.
Yeah. Yep.
He created people profiles or he created data sets for them.
Yeah.
And then there was a second kind of item that he created, and maybe it was for publications.
I mean, so for people, there's roles, and roles can connect the data sets. You can also have different kinds of documents can be listed in like different categories. So that's a thing too.
Yeah. Well,
I'm
anyway,
not sure what thing you're referring to.
well, I have notes on this somewhere, but anyway, whatever it was particularly the data set thing. He said that made it easier. It helped the transition of that stuff. It helped that stuff get migrated when the website was upgraded.
Right, which makes sense.
But I don't know who's gonna keep doing that.
Well, it shouldn't need, so it's like, the thing of it is it got set up that way, but not everything, like, it's like you're taking a huge amount of information and then you're like, oh, well, we're going to alphabetize it. Right. And so we're going to like do it. And then somebody else was like, no, actually there's this Dewey Decimal thing. We're going to do that. And so then it gets all updated to that and things get messed up in each update. But I do think that we're kind of hitting a threshold of like how it's now in a database. And as long as nobody's dumb enough to delete the tagging database, then it tells you where everything is. It's like, these are all the things that align with that data set,
Yeah.
And presumably
Okay.
they've got backups, one would hope.
Well, it was either you or it was he who said, if faculty only spent a little bit of time doing this themselves, then, it would be great.
Yeah, I'm learning the wonders of trying to reach out to faculty and get them to do things. And I deeply respect that they are very busy doing authentically important things. And
Well, so anyway, I'm still working on that, but I've been sidetracked by a couple of other ways in which I might be involved in some future training activities that use materials that I created a long time ago. Working with Veronique, partly in Senegal with the institute that they're supporting there, which happens to be an institute that was set up through a project that I was on in Senegal, living in Senegal. And then she thinks there may be a demand for some training on benefit cost analysis, which could use some of the stuff that I've done for that, including a couple of webinars I gave as part of the project in Nigeria. So, and then I got I got involved in helping to clean up the submission of the reports and data sets for this Afghanistan project. And I'm going to be done with that in a day or so, I hope. And then we'll see what demand there's going to be for this training, and I'll help Dave a little bit with this proposal. But then we'll do some traveling. We're going to London. My wife and I were going to London later in February for a couple weeks, and we'll have to go back again in.
Have to go back? That sounds like a yay. We get to go back.
Yeah, well, we'll have to go back again. I think it's in April for an event that involves our granddaughter there. And then we may go to Portugal in August for some vacation.
I hear good things about Portugal, that it's lovely to visit.
Yeah. Well, our son who lives in London, he's married to a woman from Portugal, and she and her family had property in southern Portugal, which is on the coast, which is a popular tourist area. And so that's fun.
Gonna do some fun stuff.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I want to finish the I have some electronic archiving that I want to do, some of which is miscellaneous, but the first thing I want to finish up is the stuff for my class, for my course.
Did we get everything? Or is that, did I get you
Well, I'm
everything on
not,
that?
I was going to ask you about that. I don't know whether you're sure you got through all of the.
I should go back. I'll need to just go back and really look through it and sort
Well,
through it. I think I did, but
you aren't
I don't
done.
know.
You're nearly done. I mean, I think
Yeah.
that there may have been at most a handful, like two or three, that you may still not have gone through. I don't know.
I'll have to go check.
You were close to having gone through all of those, at which point I could then, I'd want to sit with you just to identify which ones have been cleaned up, and then I'll take those. We'll figure out some place to archive those. I know I've interacted with the people at University Archives, and I know that they'll want to help get that digitally archived, and then I'll be basically done with that.
Yeah, I know. I was pushing really hard at the end of right before December break to get all of that done. And I think I did, but I also didn't kind of go I need to go double check that. And honestly, I got really sidetracked building the Cassie website because that was a lot.
Yeah. Okay, so that's the story on that. I've got a place on OneDrive where I've been doing some archiving of the course materials, but then I wanted to have a set of the lectures, the recorded lectures that had been cleaned up to the best of our ability.
Yeah. As much as it's definitely improved. It's they're better than they were. You can hear a lot more of it. I don't know. Obviously, I'm just listening, but I'm like, oh yeah, okay.
Yeah. Okay. Well, if you want to follow up on this to do some video.
Yeah, I'll work through it. I've got some lovely quotes, people saying really nice things about you. So, I'll work that up, and I'd like to kind of create a narrative. And then I love the idea of starting to capture some video again. And I'm not the videographer that Jim is, obviously, but you can learn things, and I think that it would be really valuable.
Yeah. Okay. All right, great. Okay, well, I think I'm gonna get out of what I was doing here with Adobe and
good luck.
Come back to it tomorrow.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, great.
All right. Thank you. Thank you
Okay,
so
yeah,
much.
you're welcome. All right, take care.
You too. Bye.